Hey everyone, it's Pastor Jaymes from the Table Church, and I get to be part of this program put on by the Cooperating Christian Churches of Orville about discussing how Christians and churches have approached difficult times. And when I think about how to do that, I think about church history. There's so much going on in history that we can learn from, and unfortunately, what I've learned over the years is that American Christians, including myself, we have such an amnesia about church history and what the church has done and what the church has gone through and what the church teaches throughout history. We belong to a 2,000-year-old historic faith, and I think there's some lessons from the past that we can explore, especially since we keep using words and ideas like unparalleled, right? Uncharted. We're in uncharted territories. Or the big one that we've all heard a million times, unprecedented. And when we look at history, what we realize is that none of these are true. The church has been through these types of times, if not even more difficult of these types of times. So what I'm going to do is I want to look at history. I want to talk about 3 historic pandemics. I want to talk about 3 authors who wrote during those times, Christians, and how they encouraged us to approach these times, and we want to do some takeaways from that, because I'm going to give you a wall of text. I'm going to give you a list of text, right? And we're going to look at it. We're going to read it. It's going to be a little bit boring, but afterwards, I'm going to pull out some takeaways that I'm learning and using as I approach these times. Let's dive right in. The first one is the plague of Cyprian. It happened in the middle of the 200s, and it lasted for 13 years. It was an Ebola-like virus. It was brutal. And I don't want to go into all the details, but there was some vomiting, there was some diarrhea, there were sores. People lost limbs, and ultimately, bloody eyes. It got really bad, and lots of people died. In fact, at its peak, about 5,000 people are reported to have died daily just in the city of Rome. It was brutal. And the reason it's called the plague of Cyprian is because Saint Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage at the time, he wrote about it, and he wrote to Christians, and he encouraged them, and he taught them how to get through. And so here comes one of those walls of text. I'm going to make it big so you can see it, but I will also read it. It says, "What a grandeur of spirit it is to struggle with all the powers of an unshaken mind against so many onsets of devastation and death. What sublimity to stand erect amid the desolation of the human race, and not to lie prostrate with those who have no hope in God, but rather to rejoice and to embrace the benefit of the occasion, that in thus bravely showing forth our faith and by suffering endured, going forward to Christ by the narrow way that Christ trod." That's some old language. But 3 takeaways I have from what St. Cyprian is encouraging us. Number 1, our faith gives us a clarity of mind, he says, a supernatural clarity. And that is important in our day and age with so much going on around conspiracy theories and whatnot. We are going to need some clarity of mind, and our faith provides that for us. Number 2, he says, our faith gives us a courage to stand up. He says to stand erect. To stand up tall in the midst of incredibly difficult times. He says, unlike those who have no hope, we are able to stand tall in incredibly difficult times, and that's one of the things our faith gives us. And ultimately, he says all this happens because our faith always shines most when we embrace suffering like Jesus did, which is a countercultural virtue that Christians have pushed since the beginning. That it's actually in the embrace of suffering that our faith in Jesus shines most brightly. Let's jump ahead like 1,200 years and head into the second wave of the bubonic plague. There was lots of reoccurrences of the bubonic plague, and one happened in the 1520s during Martin Luther. Martin Luther, we know, he's one of the Protestant reformers, maybe the main one, who was able to challenge the church during some difficult times and push back on some of the abuses that were going on. And he was asked how Christians and clergy and other people should approach the plague. This is him, Mr. Martin Luther. And here's what he says. I'm going to make this bigger as well. He says, "You ought to think this way." I mean, very forceful. He says, "I shall ask God," this is how we're to think. "I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take medicine. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance infect and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely, as stated above. See, this is such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy, and does not tempt God. There's a lot there. It's a huge letter. I'm hoping to put the link to it in the description so that if you wanted to read further, you could. But he has so much going on. And what I'm taking away from his letter, both from that quote and from the letter in general, is that he wants us to support frontline workers. In fact, he goes on and on about hospitals and workers there. Second, he wants us to cooperate with government and health officials. He says at the beginning there, we're going to help fumigate the air. We're going to help administer medicine if needed, and we're going to take it. Yeah. And then lastly, he says that we're going to stay home when need be. But also, we're not afraid to enter into situations when we need to help our neighbor, to help our family, to help church members. He says we have a strict duty to be helpful here. The love of God compels us to love our neighbor well. But one of the ways, he says, is a good and godly way of loving our neighbor is that we get to stay home, right? That we don't need to brashly or needlessly enter into situations and endanger ourselves or others. Is a good and godly way to talk about how to approach these types of pandemics. Let's jump ahead another, I think, 400 years into the 1918 Spanish flu, something that maybe we've heard more about. But how did the church respond? I read a diary entry recently from a bishop of a Free Methodist church. His name was B.R. Jones. It is my tradition. I'm not trying to push my tradition here. It was just something that was helpful for me. And in his diary, he talked about how the churches approached the Spanish influenza. So here comes another wall of text with some takeaways. I'll make it bigger for us. He says this: during the first part of the year, we were greatly handicapped in our work by the dreaded disease, Spanish influenza. Nearly all of our churches were closed for weeks and not a service was held. This had a depressing effect on the spiritual condition of the work. But notwithstanding all we had to encounter, almost all of the preachers have held special meetings on their charges, and with some results. And in our judgment, we think the work is on the upgrade. It is with a sense of pleasure that we close the year's work and take a retrospect and see how the Lord has blessed by giving us grace and physical strength to execute the work assigned us. But in view of what has been done and what might have been accomplished, it is with humble hearts we prostrate ourselves in the dust before the Lord and seek a greater baptism of the Holy Spirit for the purpose that we may be more aggressive and useful. Here is my takeaway from what he's talking about. Some good stuff, some bad stuff, some hard stuff, but ultimately some helpful stuff, I think. One, he shares with us that 100 years ago, even though they don't have the same knowledge of germ theory that we have, they don't understand germs like we do and viruses and things like that. He says church services were disrupted. They didn't meet for weeks, he said, weeks and weeks and weeks. And it had a negative spiritual effect overall on the people, but very normal for services to be disruptive. He says, but ministry still pushed forward creatively. This is what he tells us. Ministry pushed forward creatively. Pastors came up with creative solutions. And he says, we look back gladly and gratefully that good stuff happened. He said, the work is on the upgrade, he says. They were successful in what they tried to do. And lastly, I think what we learned from him is that there was much to be thankful for. There was much to lament. I mean, they wrote down names upon names of people who were lost in the Spanish flu. And he says there was much work to be done when things normalized. And one of my big takeaways is that they were successful. You and I are living proof. You and I are living proof that their efforts were successful. That when things normalized, they got back to work. But in the meantime, in the middle of the issues, services were disrupted, but they were able to continue on creatively and successfully. Let's wrap this up, right? In conclusion, what does Saint Cyprian teach us? He teaches us that this is an incredible opportunity to show how our faith gives us supernatural clarity, unwavering courage, a willingness to embrace suffering like Jesus did, all by the power of the Holy Spirit for the glory of the Father and to help people around us experience the love of Jesus. I mean, people came to faith because of Christians' approach, bravery, courage to pandemics and plagues during the time of St. Cyprian. What does Martin Luther teach us? Martin Luther teaches us that it is good and godly to help and engage when we can. And it is also good and godly to stay put for the most part to prevent spread. And it is good and godly to cooperate with officials, health and government and otherwise, right? And what does Bishop Jones teach us about the Spanish influenza? He shows us that in-person services were temporarily disrupted. That whatever our church communities are experiencing is not new. This happened 100 years ago. And I assume it'll happen again in the future as well. Ministry still happens successfully, though. The people prayed, lamented, and got to work when they could. And we are living proof that their efforts were effective. And so I hope this look back at the church and Christian history and their approach to pandemics and plagues is helpful to you. I pray that it is a blessing to your soul, that it is an encouragement to you, that we are able to weather any storm, and that this isn't unprecedented, unparalleled, or uncharted, but that our Christian forebearers, the mothers and fathers that have gone before us, have gone through times just like this, maybe even harder times, and yet they have emerged valiant, victorious, successful, that their faiths were intact, their faith communities remained intact, and that they were able to continue on the mission and work of God in their neighborhoods and beyond. Would you be blessed? Would you be at peace? Grace.